Well, they wanted to record it, and then they wanted to share it on the Facebook page later, or try to. And there's a couple people on it, looks like. So maybe put it on a share. It'll work. You guys got a buddy. Hopefully it works. So we have a couple people on. Can you guys hear me at all? Hopefully.
Can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
You bet.
Okay. We'll try this and see if it works. Okay. All right. Okay, so we'll get started. See if anyone can focus on the whiteboard when we get to that. So thanks for coming to our fruit tree class. My name is Ben Scow. I'm the county agriculture agent, but I'm also, some of my credentials for fruit trees is my family has grown fruit trees for commercially for about 70, 80 years here in Hurricane. So we've grown fruit trees here for a long time. And my wife and I are one of probably 2 or 3 commercial growers left in Washington County. So we grow mostly peach trees as our primary crop. We don't grow too much else at this point. We're going to try apricots and some other things, but we're familiar with those. But one apricot tree produces a lot of apricots. So we've never wanted to grow any. But so our background's in fruit trees. I've also went to school and learned a lot more about fruit trees and why we do some of the things that we do to have a good crop. So the goal with me for this class is try and get people to be able to grow large, good quality fruit from their backyard fruit trees. So I have 800 fruit trees. You guys probably have 1 or 2 or maybe more than that if you have a larger backyard. But I wanted to try and show you the commercial production that you can do in your own backyard to get a large, good size fruit that's good quality. So I've always been told, what we tell people is that like a peach tree, for example, will produce about 100 pounds of fruit per year, a good healthy peach tree will. So that's quite a bit of fruit, but you can either have a lot of little fruit, 100 pounds of small fruit, or you can have 100 pounds of large fruit. And it's all in how you manage your fruit trees, how you take care of them, and keep them going from year to year. So there's a lot of different fruit trees. And one of the questions we always get at the extension office are, what fruit trees grow well here? And the answer is really you can grow just about anything except for citrus. We don't do citrus so well here because it doesn't like being frozen, and we do get a pretty good killing crop. So peaches do phenomenally well here. Cherries, apricots, plums, pluots, if you're familiar with those. One of the unique things we can grow in our climate in Utah, we can grow pomegranates, which if you go much farther north, it's too cold, and pomegranates, the bush will grow, but you won't get any pomegranates off of it. Fig trees are another one that we can grow. It's a little bit unique to our climate, and we're kind of on the border where figs will work. Another one called a loquat. It's similar to a fig, but you can grow loquats here as well. So there's some unique ones that we can grow. Overall, though, we can grow about any type of fruit tree that you would like besides. So there's some tips and tricks to each of them. So we're going to try and go over those. I wanted to start with tree selection. Then we're going to go into, I think we'll do fertilizer, thinning, harvest, pruning. And pruning is one we're not going to go over actually how to prune. We're going to go over some of the different styles. And then later in the year, we're going to actually do a pruning. So the first thing we want to go over is tree selection. And if I don't go over a fruit tree that you're interested in, just raise your hand and ask me about what about apricots or apples, pears, whichever. But fruit tree selection does depend on you guys and what you want to eat or what your kids are going to eat. So if your kids don't like peaches, probably don't want a peach tree. Unless they've only had store-bought peaches, then try growing one because they taste a lot better. That's my bias. So depends on what you will eat, what your kids can eat, and what you want to grow. We put fruit trees into mainly two categories. So we have what are called palm fruit. And then we have what are called stone fruit. I wanted to point that out because each of them have their own unique set of pests that are unique to this type of tree. So a palm fruit, if you cut it in half, you can actually cut all the way through it. You'll see the seeds in the middle. These are things like apples or pears. Quince is another one. It doesn't have anything hard in the middle. So our palm fruits, we have apples, pears, and I think anyone had a quince. Okay, a couple of you.
She's coming right back.
And stone fruit, we have, so if you cut in half, you're gonna hit something hard in the middle. They have a pit in the middle. So the ones that come on first are cherries, plums, apricots, the main ones that we have in these two groups. And they do have their own unique pests, so we're going to talk about pest management as well. That's probably one of the biggest things that fruit trees in our area are the pests. So any questions you have about those, we'll go over in a few minutes. But we'll have palm fruits, apples, pears, quince. They ripen differently than a stone fruit does, so we're going to prune them differently. And we'll talk about pruning in a minute. So stone fruit, cherries, plums, apricots, and the pruning sizes are a little bit different too. Go ahead.
Pomegranates are completely different.
They are, and I'm not sure what group they're showing. But you can, pomegranates are fun because you can prune them two different ways too. You can prune them and leave them as a bush, which is most common if you ever go to someone's house and people have a hedge of pomegranates. They're usually a bush. They have a whole bunch of shoots coming out of the ground, so more of a shrub almost. But you can actually prune them into an actual tree if you wanted to and have a pomegranate tree. Not as common. They're a little bit more labor intensive, but they look really cool. And the pomegranates are like pomegranates somewhere in the middle. So when you're selecting your trees, you can go to the nursery, you can order them online. There's a lot of different places that you can get your fruit trees. When you order them or when you get them, you can get different sizes. And this is important according to your yard. So some people have a really small yard and you can get a dwarf tree, semi-dwarf, or a standard. Standard are on their own rootstock and they'll typically be a pretty large tree. A peach, if you just plant it in the ground, let it grow and never prune it, you can get them to be 30 feet tall by 30 feet wide. They get huge. At that point, they're really unmanageable. You can't get a good fruit size when they're that long. If you get a semi-dwarf, you're trying to keep them closer to 20 feet by 20 feet. And then if you get a full dwarf, they're closer to probably 10, and you can keep them even smaller than that. If you do get a dwarf tree, typically you have to stake them though. They'll produce a large fruit, not as many, but they get pretty good size, but they're a smaller tree and they're a little bit weak. So you usually have to stake a dwarf. Semi-dwarf is the standard one that most people will carry, and they're the easiest to find. They do require pruning. I asked my mother-in-law. So yeah. Yes. So if you have a standard one, if it's on its own rootstock, they do tend to get larger. They're really vigorous, which is one of the benefits is they will produce a lot of growth each year, and you can prune them and keep them. You can keep them at a smaller level, but usually have a little more wood to cut out. But yeah. And the most common is going to be a semi-dwarf. So they keep them a little bit smaller. The way they do that and the way they have those different sizes is by putting them on a different rootstock. So you'll have. So when you're buying them at a nursery, usually you'll notice that the tree, so if you got like a bare root tree, they have a little bit, kind of like a dog leg in them. So they all look weird. They have these little arches, a couple inches off the ground. So this is your rootstock, the bottom part. Then this top part they've grafted a different tree onto it. This is the tree that you want. So if you wanted like a lemon Alberta peach tree or a Chinese apricot, they're going to take a cutting off of the parent tree and they're going to graft it to that rootstock, and that rootstock will keep it from getting larger. It will control how tall and large that tree gets. Sometimes they have disease resistance, and some of them are more salt tolerant. So we can change the tree a little bit by putting it on a different rootstock. We can change some of its growth characteristics, mostly to keep it smaller though. Top part, not super important, but they call it a scion when you graft it to your rootstock. You don't really need any of that. So that's kind of what most fruit trees come on. This applies to all your stone fruit, and pretty much all of your palm fruit as well. So your apples, they'll all be on a different rootstock when you buy them at a tree. So some like common ones, if you ever buy a cherry tree, they'll have two tags on your fruit trees. One will be for the variety you're getting, the fruit you want, and the other one will be for the rootstock. So if you bought a cherry, most of the time it's on a Mazard rootstock. Most people have heard of that one. And then apples have a whole range of different rootstocks. That's the idea. When you buy a fruit tree, you can get different sizes, and that's how they do it. They put them on a different rootstock. The other thing that's important when you're selecting them, so we have sides, depending on the size of your yard or how much space you have to plant fruit trees, you can get different sizes of trees. The other important thing is finding out if they're self-fruitful or self-pollinating, or if they require a second tree to pollinate. So what we mean by that is if I planted a Granny Smith apple, I want to make pies, or I like the tartness of a nice Granny Smith apple. I plant it in my backyard, 5 years go by and it blooms, everything looks great, but I never get a apple form on that tree. It's usually because I don't have another tree of a different variety close enough to pollinate. This applies mostly to apples and cherries. Apples and cherries, for the most part, there's always an exception, but they require a second variety of an apple or cherry to pollinate. Well, I couldn't have two Granny Smiths next to each other. I have to have a Granny Smith and a Gala, or a Fuji and a Gala are two common ones because they both do well here, but we'll plant those together. They'll cross-pollinate, you'll get apples. Pears are a little bit unique. Does anyone have pears or like pears? You know what varieties you guys have? Bartlett. Bartlett's the most common. Another one is D'Anjou. It's another common one. Those are two of the oldest varieties. They're old enough, and the genetics are in such a way that they'll produce fruit by themselves. But if you have a second tree of a different variety, so if I have my Bartlett and I have a D'Anjou pear next to each other, they'll produce heavy. So you'll always get fruit with a pear, but if you want a little bit more production, you can plant a second pear. They're a little unique and they break the rule, but that's how they are. Apples, they won't produce at all if you don't have a second variety. If you have a neighbor though too, and if you have bees, you're good. If you have a neighbor that has apple trees and they'll cross-pollinate, they don't care about the fence, they'll cross over and they'll pollinate. Yeah. What I've been told about between kind of a range, but I've heard between 100 feet and 500 feet. That's a pretty good range if you so a neighbor or a couple people in your community, if they have them and enough bee activity, you can get some pollination.
On the pear, does it have to be the same kind of pear? Does it have to be different?
It has to be different. Yep.
You know, the pear, it has to be different.
Yep.
You can have a Bartlett, then you have to have
Yep. Have a different kind. Asian pears. If anyone's ever had Asian pears, they're kind of fun. There's boss pears. Don't care for those too much, but some people really like them.
on the Asian pear, which I have another Asian pear. I have to have a Bartlett pear.
Yep. You do. So pears.
Okay.
I will too. Bartlett's my favorite. So that's with pears and apples. Quinces are similar to pears that way. I don't know if they're a little self-fruitful or not. I've met many people that plant those, so I don't really know. Then we get to stone fruits. We'll go back to those. So we'll do cherries. Cherries are a little bit tricky to grow. We'll go over with pest management is our main problem with cherries. We'll go over that. Okay. Bing, okay. Oh, it's hard cherry. Okay, so it might be a Montmorton seed. Might be.
Probably.
Good. Those are the best kind. There's some that are yellow though. You gotta be careful. But with cherries, there are some. This is where there's a couple that break the rule and there's some. Also, everyone loves being that's old industry.
Put Jody in there.
Cherry that have really good flavor, but it requires a second pollinator. So if you want to do a being, which most people really like the being for the size, you have to plant two. A Stella, though, you guys have a Stella. Stella is self-pollinating, and lapis are two of the main ones that you can plant if you want. If you only have room for one tree, either a Stella or a lapis. Yeah, lapis. Those are two that are self-fruit by themselves. Probably different. Yeah. So there's a lot of old orchards, and most of them, for whatever reason, have three cherry trees. They're typically different. If you watch them, some of them will ripen close to the same time, and sometimes they'll just ripen a little bit different. They're different varieties. That's what the old pioneers is. They would plant three. From what I would imagine, they'd have one in the middle to make sure they're pollinating the two outside ones. So that's a common practice, but yeah, they plant them in a row and they have different ones for cherries. Unless they did all Stella, which I don't know if they had that Stella as an option back then. I think they had Bing as one of the old ones. Lapins is one that they would have used, and Black Tartarian were three of the more common ones we've had in our area. And if you want a really dark black cherry, Black Tartarian's the standard. Otherwise, if you want to do any other type of cherry, you usually have to get two besides Stella. And there's a lot of varieties. There's the tart ones, and those will work for sweet cherries. They will pollinate, cross-pollinate them. They're actually a little bit heavier, more pollen. So some people will plant their sour tart cherry next to their sweet.
What's the word? Hey, Tony.
Tart ones, I'm not sure about those. They might. Well, I haven't looked into this. They might.
Oh, do you want to go right now? Are you ready? I just
Yellow with the red, pink blush.
Yes, if you want, I've got this trailer.
They have a
We can put a couple things on it, the big things or whatever.
Yep.
It is. Is this the 20-footer that you're talking about?
No,
No, that's my trailer. This is my dad's trailer.
about just
Oh, that's the one that was in the covered in garbage. The tub? Yeah. Yeah, okay.
look up a.
I found that tub, that Rubbermaid tub at the dump.
Someone's doing some composting. You can look up a pollination chart. So you either just do an apple pollination chart, and they'll come up. The different nurseries will carry cherry pollination chart. It comes up as a grid, so it'll have the varieties, and then where they match up, it'll let you know if they pollinate. So that's how the pollination chart. So if you're curious about it, just want to make sure, look up a pollination chart. Make sure that they are.
Is it all fruit that can be like 100 feet away from each other? Like you can cherries do that too?
Yep, cherries can do that, apples, and if they need a second pollinator, yep, they can be within that range and they'll be fine. Some that are self-fruitful though, peaches are self-fruitful, so you only need one. Some apricot, most apricot varieties and plum varieties are self-fruitful. There are some exceptions with apricots, some require two. If you get into like the pluot, so pluot, if you've never had them, they're kind of fun. I haven't seen them around too much, but they take a plum and an apricot and they cross them. That's how you get the pluot or aprium. It's another name that they'll call them, but they crossed them, and some of those need a second pollinator. Not all the time. Any questions on pollination or any problems you guys have?
So I have a cherry tree that it's like flowered on one side and not the other side.
Okay.
And so it has a pecan tree that I'm curious if it's like shade or wind or like my house, like can the sunlight hours impact whether they blossom or like could it have frozen on one side?
It could have frozen on one side, or it could have gotten some sun. They call it sun scald, where the sun will actually scorch part of the tree. Did it leaf out?
The leaves were all fine.
It just didn't bloom.
And I can't remember if it blossomed on that side and then no fruit came on, but I think it didn't even get blossoms on it. one side, like my other tree and this side of that tree.
Does that side get shaded much?
Yeah, like,
Okay, it
like my
does?
house shade is on one
Okay.
side too, and I
Yeah.
haven't watched it, but maybe I should.
Oh, you're good. So one of the things that happens with some fruit trees is they're very sensitive to light. So they're trees, if they had a brain, I always pretend like my trees have a brain so I can talk to them and have a conversation. But for a fruit tree, if it's going to put on fruit and it's going to be good quality fruit or viable, it wants it to be in the sunlight. So if the part of the tree is in the shade, it will produce fewer blossoms on that side. Sometimes if it gets a lot of shade, it may not produce any at all in extreme. I'm not seeing that, but it can happen. Peaches do that though. So in the middles, if they're shaded a lot in the middle of the tree, they won't produce blossoms in the middle. They'll be on the top. So they are sensitive to sunlight. So that might be it. Sometimes there's just some freak accidents. And if it's every year, we might have to look at that. But if it was 1 year, hopefully it's just a 1 year.
I have a question. On plums, you mentioned plums. Can we grow, and I don't know the name of it. Inside.
There's
I
different
don't want the
kinds.
yellow inside, I want the red inside. What's the name of that? I try to find the store, I
Yeah.
can't find it, and I'm disappointed when I get home, because they say they're red.
Red. There's one called Elephant Heart, I believe is really red on the inside. So if you're going to buy an actual tree, look up those characteristics. But I think Elephant Heart is one that will do that. There's some that I think they have like blood red or blood plums in the name. I can't remember what the varieties are.
And do I need to have a second one of those?
You'd have to look up that specific variety. Some may, most don't. So like Santa Rosa is the most common plum that most people have. It's a good tasting plum. They're yellow on the inside, so you would like it. But they don't require a second one. But I'm sure there are some that may require. So you'd have to you want to double check. Then you'd have two. So that'd be great. But then that one you'd have to have two different varieties. So, okay. Any other pollination questions before we move on to the next? Okay. So one of the questions I usually get a couple times a year, it's one of my favorite ones, is I am not getting large sized fruit. And what do I need to change to get larger, better quality? There's three things that go into fruit size that affect it the most that I've found. One is fertilizing. And fruit trees do need a pretty good amount of fertilizer. The second is water. And the third one is thinning. And thinning is probably the largest factor. The other two you do once a year, and thinning you do once a year too, but that's one that you have a lot of control over, is how large your fruit's going to be by thinning it. So the first one is fertilizing. Fruit trees do need to be fertilized at least once a year. Some people will do a second fertilizer halfway through the year and they'll split it. So I can't give you a good recommendation for fertilizer necessarily, because everyone's in here is going to have different soil in their yards. It's going to have a different nutrient level. The best way to figure out what your soil will need for a fruit tree is to do a soil test and see where your nutrients are at. The most common source to get a soil sample is Utah State University. I happen to work for them, so I'm trying not to be biased, but every soil lab is unique to that area and that geographical zone. So Utah State is very familiar with the Rocky Mountain area, so they will give you a recommendation that's more fit for our soils. We've had people that send them back east, and the eastern soils are so much different than ours, they can't give us a good recommendation, and they're usually all over the place. Our pH level is so high, and they're usually trying to figure out what in the world they did to their soil to get it that way, and it creates problems. So do a local one. Either Utah State is the only one I know of in Utah. There's one called Stolzenheim in Idaho would be another one that you can use. That would be a pretty good recommendation. You do a soil test, see where your nutrients are at, and that'll give you a recommendation for your fertilizer for that year. And you only have to do them every so many years. You might just do it a couple years down the road to make sure it's about the same level. They cost between $20 and $50 to do a soil test, but you only have to do them once for the most part. And then if something's doing something weird, if your trees aren't growing the way you think they should, do another soil test. Yeah. So yeah, so if we look at a soil profile, have our cute little they have what's called the topsoil, and that's the most of the fruit trees and any tree's roots are going to be in that top 2 feet. That's where most of the roots, the majority, probably 80 to 90% of your roots are going to be in the first top 2 feet of soil. And you do have tap roots that will go down and branch off, but the really fibrous roots that are going to take up most of the water and most of the nutrients are in that top 2 feet. The top 2 feet is what we typically call topsoil, and it will have a different nutritional value than it will farther down in the soil profile, because everything that's, if you have lawn or if you have compost or anything, it's going to reside in that 2 feet. Farther down, it will be different. So when you do a soil test, you're only going to be taking actually the first foot, is what most soil tests require, is where your sample is going to be. But that's where all the nutrients live, the most active roots are. When you apply a fertilizer, there's a couple ways to do it. The easiest is to do a granule. It's the most common. It's a commercialized one, what they call commercialized fertilizer, because they take all the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, put it in a prill that dissolves and goes into the soil. You can do compost and manures. They work just fine as well. It's hard to gauge how much nutrients you're giving them with manure and compost, just because we don't know the readings on those all the time. You can do a test on those as well, just to see if you're really into that. You can do a liquid fertilizer and fertilize with the liquid, just have it soak into the roots and take it up. Where you want to apply it though is what's called the drip line. The drip line is if you drew or if you put like a tarp over your tree, and the drip line is the outermost edge of the tree. So you're going to be applying fertilizer at the drip line. So usually if you do a commercial fertilizer, we just do a circle. I'll just walk around the drip line and put it in a circle around the tree. Liquid's not as critical because it goes farther down and the roots will take it up just fine. But that you don't want to apply it out here. It's not going to do you too much. You want to apply it between the drip line and the tree where they work okay. They think you have to make sure they're getting water to them, and if they are, you're okay.
Yeah, that's the thing I've seen with that too. Drip line. Basically, you got to move your water as the tree grows. It's
Gotta get big. Yep. Yes. So if you're filling up, well, I guess we can go into watering too. So most people will make a berm, and then they'll fill this up with water once a week, once every between 1 to 2 weeks. That dissolves those frills really well. If you're doing fertilizer stakes, so the stakes, they basically look like that. You poke them into the ground, and then it's a slower release. It slowly releases through the air, so they're a good option. You just want to make sure that they're around the drip line and they're in that watering area, so they'll dissolve. Yep, they work this way. So questions on fertilizer? We'll go on irrigation next.
I know how
Put it on. That's where if you do a soil test, they'll tell you about how much. That's the hardest part, is I can't give a super good recommendation. Typically, you're putting on depending on what fertilizer you put on, between 4 and 8 cups around the perimeter of the. Yep. And if you don't have the money to do a soil test, you can do a 16, 16, 16 and start. If it's a fully mature tree, you're probably going to be closer to the 6 to 8 cup range. If it's a new tree, you probably want to start at 3 to 4 cups if it's small. Any other questions?
Is there a best time of year to do the fertilizer?
Yes, thank you. I was going to cover that one. Spring. Spring is the best time. If you're on a flood irrigation system where some houses still are, you want to do it early spring and you try and catch rain to drive that fertilizer into the ground. So February is when a lot of people put them on, but if you can do February, March is the best time to put them on. Yep. Another thing with fertilizer too, try not to apply it in the fall. So if we apply fertilizer in the fall, the tree gets a shot of energy and says, "Oh, I'm going to keep growing," and starts to cut out a bunch of growth, and then it freezes and it can cause some problems. So, spring's the best time, and all that growth. It takes a little while to put on fruiting wood, so it gives them all summer to put in some energy into the fruiting wood versus just the fall. So spring is the best time, or early. Okay. It's not, but you want to make sure they're getting a little more water, and you might fertilize them a little bit more around that tree. If they're right in the line, which is common, and it does look nice too, but Putting a lot of fertilizer, especially in a really concentrated ring, if you do a granule, it will burn your lawn. And on the inside, it will grow 8 times faster than the rest of it. But that's where the spikes would probably be the best option. Then watering is another issue that we have, especially on years like this where it gets so hot. There's different options that you can irrigate or water your tree. Some people are on a flood irrigation system. Others have a landscaping where they have drip systems. Does anyone have a drip system for their drip? A lot of people are doing drip. Anyone doesn't do flood still, or just water them with the hose? Right, okay. And they all work. You just have to make sure you hit them at the right points. So if we have a young tree, they obviously don't need as much water, but usually when we put them into a landscape, we're putting them on with one emitter. That's all they need. They don't need more water. We don't want to waste water. So you have your drip line that runs in, you put one emitter on it. And the trick is not to forget about that one emitter when your tree gets bigger. So once it gets to like this size, that one emitter is not going to cut it anymore. It needs a lot more water. So you got to make sure you come back in and you put in more emitters to water a larger fully grown tree. From talking to some of the growers that have a drip system are watering between 20 gallons and 50 to 60 gallons a week per tree. So depending on what type of emitters you have, some are like 1 gallon per hour. You have to let that run for 20 hours if you have just one. And if you have more, obviously, that is the biggest problem we see in landscapes is people will plant a fruit tree or the landscape as well, and then they got to go back and put more. A fruit tree likes to have dry spells a little bit in between watering. That's why we don't water them every day or every other day necessarily. We're watering really heavy and deep, typically once a week. Trees can stretch to about 2 weeks at the most if we're in drought circumstances, which we're kind of getting into, right? So if you're going out with the hose, water really good once a week. You can make a berm around them to catch that water, fill up your water wells or what they call them, and let them percolate down and water really heavy. Any questions on watering? Big, but hard to, everyone has different systems. So I
I
can't.
do have a question. If I choose to do it with a hose, when will I know when it needs water? Tester, you know, those.
There's different things you can do. There are some probes you can stick in the soil. It'll give you a reading. You have to get familiar with that individual probe that you use. The easiest way I found is to just go and dig around a little bit, see am I having to dig down quite a bit? It's still dry. Is it still really damp underneath that top crust? If it's really damp still, then just let it go for a couple of days. Go and check it again. The finger test, I guess, is what I usually call it. But you have to go out, you have to dig around a little bit just to see where your soil's at. Everyone's is a little bit different because if you have a sandy soil, you may have to water a little bit more regularly. If it's a clay soil, it's less frequent and you're still putting on. Anyone have a really sandy soil? Guys, where do you guys live in, like Dixie Springs or? Yeah,
So all.
it's sand. Yep.
No nutrients in it.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you're planting trees, you guys probably did this or may have, but you can put compost in with the soil. If it's really sandy, mix some compost in it. Compost will help hold the moisture a little bit as well. But for a sandy soil, you probably can't get by with once a week. I would think you have to water it. And it might work because it is pure sand out there. So
I gotta say on that, as the tree gets bigger.
more emitters. Yep. How do you know if you're overwatering a tree is another question I get. You guys ever had that question? It dies if it's really bad, right? If you find the leaves are turning yellow, is the #1 sign that you're overwatering. So what that does is there's nutrients in the soil that the tree has to have to make chlorophyll, the green part of the leaf. Iron's one of them, and nitrogen's another one. There's a couple other micronutrients that it requires. Iron causes the most problems because when we water so much, it liquefies the iron a little bit and it just pushes it past the root zone if we're overwatering, then it'll start to turn yellow. If you cut back on the water, you can actually watch the green color start to come back, or you can supplement with chelated iron. I gotta see where I'm at on here on tangents. Okay, so that's, yeah, go ahead.
So the leaves are looking kind of dull. I mean,
If they're starting to droop, you have to do a little bit of investigation. So if it's drooping a little bit, it could be the part where you're overwatering so much, it might be suffocating the roots. So you have to see if it's like sopping wet. If it is, then it's too much water. And just let it dry out, see if you can get it to come back. Or if it's bone dry, then it's drought. It's one or the other. It's overwatering or underwatering. If they're droopy and not looking dull. Okay, I brought some leaves so you can look at it. It might be a pest problem. And there are different pests. Is it a peach tree? It might be similar. So there's some pests that overlap ornamentals too. Yeah. Yep. It is. Yeah, so Ray Ballard at Ballard's Nursery, he gets a lot of the questions that I get to, and we tend to overwater a little bit more than. But fruit trees, if you can get them established after the first year, it's about once a week for most soils. Sandy soils, you're looking at 2 to 3. Okay. Watering. Other question? Yeah.
sorry.
You're fine.
Right now.
Yeah, really good question. Fall and spring are the best times. You can plant anytime in the summer. Once it gets over 100 degrees, the new ones stress quite a bit. So spring is the best time in early spring, and then fall is another good time. Summer you can, it's just sometimes you run a higher risk of them. Good, and if you watch, if you're like the local nursery at Ballard's, they get their fruit trees in and bare root trees early in the year, so you can plant early before they break dormancy. So they'll just be a stick basically. When they break dormancy, that means they start to bud out. So yeah, planting time, yeah, it's a good question. We should go over that. Spring is the best by far. You can plant actually in the winter or in the fall when they're completely dormant. Commercial orchards will plant one of those 2 times. They'll do fall. Once they're dormant, they'll stay dormant through the winter. Most people will plant in the spring. You get the best. I don't know if the results are different, but you can watch them a little bit closer. I can plant it, I can water it. If it doesn't leaf out, I know it didn't make it. Fall, I have to wait quite a few months and hope it makes it.
Then what months?
Yeah, I would do, it depends when they're available, but it's probably March. Typically fruit trees will start to bloom in early March or late February on a weird year, which we've had a few of those the last couple of years. That's when they'll start to break dormancy and come out. If you order them online, they come in a box. Usually you have to get them planted pretty quick after they get to your house once you've ordered them. They usually wrap the roots in shredded newspaper to keep them moist. The roots have to stay moist. If they dry out, they're ripped, they're not going to make it through. But so you can order them, but just make sure you're ready to plant them. Okay, so the watering. So going back to fruit size, watering, fertilizer make a huge difference. Thinning is probably the hardest one that people have have a hard time pulling fruit off, and I'm throwing it on the ground because you feel like you're wasting fruit, and I definitely get that. Trade-off though is you will make up quantity that you've lost in quality and volume and larger fruit. So if we have a branch, and we'll go over 2 different, so apples and pears come on a certain way, and peaches, apricots, cherries. Don't worry about cherries, but you're gonna have a branch, and they're usually, if they produce really heavy, you're gonna have these clusters. They almost look like grapes when they come on. If you leave them on, and those tree starts to get a little bit lower, which is a good thing to pick if you want them lower to the ground, but you can actually lose branches and they can break. So for the health of the tree, you almost have to thin and be committed to that when you buy a fruit tree. Otherwise, you can lose some really large branches. So on a Apricot and peach, you thin them out really heavy. You have to give them enough space to, if you want a large size peach, you have to envision each of those being a large size peach and give them enough room to be able to get to that size. So for a peach, the spacing that we're looking for is 6 inches between each fruit. So in a lot of old videos and what a lot of classes do is they tell you to do this. It's about 6 inches. So the hang loose sign, I guess, I don't know. So about 6 inches apart, you're going to remove those on both sides of the branch. You're going to try and get them to be 6 inches apart. That allows them as they grow, get to be that large size without interrupting each other and without having a large weight to break the branch. If you can, when you're thinning as well, try and keep them away from the very end of the branch, which makes sense as if you're holding like a ball, it's the heaviest out here. You can support a lot of weight right here for a lot longer because it's not out as far. The more weight you have to hold out there, you're gonna eventually start sagging. The tree's the same way. If you have a really heavy ball on the end of a small branch, it can either break or at the end of the year, it'll be curled under like this and you're gonna prune it off, which isn't a bad thing. If you can, avoid having one on the end and keep them closer to the internal part of the tree. If you can. If you can't, this is so peaches, we're looking for 6 inches. Apricots are going to do the exact same thing, except it's 4 inches. They can be spaced plus right because they're not getting this big, right? Plums, most people will let their plums go, but if you want to thin plums and get a larger size plum, you would do more of a 4-inch spacing. Similar to, they don't produce quite as clustery as a peach or an apricot does. That's why people usually leave them, and they'll be fine. They'll just be about that big. They taste fine, but they're smaller. But peaches, it makes a huge, huge difference. One for the health of the tree, but also for the size. So I love having large size peaches. It's my favorite thing in the world, but I can't do that unless I can.
Nectarines would be very true.
Yep. Nectarine, basically the only difference between a nectarine and a peach is the buds. Yep, that's the only difference. Yep. So treat a nectarine just like you would a peach. Cherries, don't worry about thinning cherries. That's a lost cause. They've done some studies on thinning cherries and it doesn't make up a whole lot of them. You might get a little bit of a bigger cherry, but it's not worth it, guys. If you ever pick cherries, it's the worst job in the world. You pick and pick and pick and pick and pick, and you have a little bucket. You pick and pick and pick and pick some more, and it just takes forever to pick them. Thinning would be even worse. So don't thin cherries. Apples, you do have to thin. Pears, not as much. And it's just the physiology of the tree. They don't put them on the same way. Apples are so stinking heavy. Commercially, they'll actually spray a chemical on the apple tree to drop some of the fruits. They don't have to thin as much by hand. The way that apples come on though, in clusters. So if you've ever had an apple tree, they come on in clusters. Each cluster, if you're looking at the bottom, gonna have between 5 and 6 apples in it. When you're thinning an apple by hand, what you're trying to do is get 1 apple per cluster. And you're almost always trying to leave the middle apple. I would want to leave this one right here. I would try and remove all the ones around it, leave the one in the middle. The one in the middle is the largest, it's easier to find. It's also less likely to break. I'll draw that one. But the stem is kind of a straight shot into the tree where all the other ones are coming off of that. You can peel them back kind of like a banana. Leave that middle one is the easiest way to thin them. You can cut them off too. You can just take some shears out and cut all the ones off except for that middle one. The middle one's called a king fruit. If you ever wanted to know, but it's just because it's the largest, that's the one we're trying to leave, and it will get the largest size when we're thinning apples. So that's a little bit with apples. They produce really heavy some years. One of the things that's important with apples is if you thin them every year, you will get apples almost every year. One year will be heavier than the other. They're biennial producers, but if you're thinning them, we won't go into it too much, but the tree will put on fruit wood for the next year, or we'll keep some of it. If you just let it go, if you don't thin it at all, the next year won't have any fruit at all. It might have 1 or 2, but it won't you really won't get a crop off of it every year. Yeah. Fruit trees are I like that in general. So peaches and apricots, they'll produce every year, but you are right. They have what's called a bumper crop year, which usually is every other year. They'll produce every year almost without fail, but 1 year typically is a bit heavy. Yeah, you're right. That's a good observation. Most people don't pick up on that. But apples, if you don't thin them, you will have apples 1 year really heavy and nothing the next year. If you thin them, it'll be more consistent. You'll get apples. And it has to do with the hormones of the tree. We won't get into that something. Pears, though, they thin themselves out pretty well. Usually you don't have to thin a pear tree. Usually okay with those. If you wanted to, you can get a larger pear if you want to thin them a little bit. If you notice they're really heavy in one spot, I usually go in and thin them. But thinning does make a huge difference, and it makes sense because if you're trying to grow a nice large fruit in a really confined space, it'll never get big. And it does cause a lot of damage to the trees. Okay. 15 minutes, so that'll give us enough time. We'll go over pruning, and then we'll do some pest management. Pest management's the biggest one, so I'll try and get through pruning pretty quick. There's two styles of pruning, and it has to do with how the plants or how the trees ripen their fruit. So a peach tree, apricot tree, cherry, plum, all the stone fruit, they require some sunlight to go through and hit the fruit to get it to ripen. So we prune them a certain way to allow more sunlight to penetrate the canopy. Apples don't really require it as much. We can pick them and they can ripen a little bit on their own without sunlight. So the traditional and the kind of tried and true way of pruning we'll do peach and apricot. Cherries, usually we don't prune too much. General rule for pruning, if the branches are crossing and rubbing, you need to prune one of them out or both if the damage is severe. If they're broken, you need to prune those out or at least prune them back to a good point. We're not going to go super deep into pruning because we could spend hours on that. If it's disease as well, if it's looking like it has something wrong with it, you need to try and get it pruned out as well. So that's general. If you walk up to a tree, you do that first. If it's broken, cut it out. If it's disease, cut it out. If they're rubbing, we need to fix that and get it cut out. The rest of it is, that's any tree. That's the first thing you're going to do when you're pruning. For a cherry tree, if you want to prune them to keep them a little bit lower, you can. We always joke that you're sacrificing the top part of your tree to the bird gods, so the birds will have something to eat, and then we try and pick what's left. Cherry trees get really large. You have to have a large ladder to be able to get to the tops to prune them. They have cherry pickers and rigs and stuff to get you up to the top if you're going to make it to the top. But usually, you got to feed the birds and appease them a little bit if you have a fully grown cherry tree. But pruning a cherry tree, you're usually just cutting out any branches that are crossing if it's really dense. Also for aesthetics, if you have one branch that's really low and growing out in a weird funky spot, you can cut it out. It's up to you what you want to do with that tree. But if you have a weird branch, if it's whacking you in the head when you're on your lawnmower or something, cut it off if you can. It's not going to hurt the tree too much. But for aesthetics and function, you have to make it. So with a peach and apricot, we're doing what's called an open base, an open center. And there's different ways to do that. The most common way, and it works well and anyone can do it, is you have your tree will come up, and then you're going to have 4 main scaffold branches coming off. If you're looking at it from the top, it's going to look like an X. You're trying to get your tree to come up, branch out in 4 different directions as evenly as you can get it. We're shooting for between 3 and 5 scaffold branches, main branches. We don't want more than that. We don't really want, you can do 2, but we want 4 main branches to come off. From there, that's where our fruit's going to hang. It also leaves this center part is going to be open. We're not going to have much growing in it. So when the sunlight hits it, the sun hits the tree, it can go through the canopy a lot easier. Versus if it was our traditional tree where it comes up, you have branches and usually get smaller and closer to the top. middle is gonna be shaded all the time. It's not gonna produce fruit there. The sun can't get through there very well. Where if it was open, it could go clear through the tree and hit the other side. So it's an open base style of pruning. We want 4 main scaffold branches to come off. Is the structure that we're looking for. It also creates really large wood that the fruit's going to hang off of, so we're not going to break branches if it gets too heavy, or it creates a really good structure and sturdy tree. So that's a peach and apricot and plum. You can do plums this way. Again, most people kind of let those go like a cherry, but you can, if you're wanting good production off of them, you can prune it this way. Apples and pears, they're different. So we are going for light penetration, so we're going to print them a bit different. The style is called a modified central leader. So what we mean by that is we have a central leader that goes up. It's kind of a traditional style of a tree. You have your main tree that goes up. Then you're going to have whorls of branches. What I mean by that is you're going to come up a ways. You're going to have 4 to 5, sometimes 6 main scaffold branches that come off. They're going to be a little bit larger. You're going to go up a little bit more, have a smaller whorl, and that's kind of a smaller whorl. That's the structure that we're looking for. So we're going to come up, you're going to have a set of branches, we'll come up a little more, smaller set of branches, come up more, smaller. Kind of like a Christmas tree idea. All the modified central leader. Also, one of the things we're doing by not cutting the top off, the way trees work is when you cut the top off, all of these usually go crazy and they want to be the king branch, I guess, and they go nuts a little bit and grow really fast and really big. So by leaving that and not cutting off the top, this is the main branch, and trees do produce hormones. And this one is kind of the king branch. It produces hormones that suppress the rest of the tree. It keeps it in a uniform shape. Sorry, that's a little bit deep, but that's one of the main differences between these 2 styles of pruning. This one, we cut it off. These 4 branches then become really large and they produce really well. This one is not as important, so we leave it, and it keeps the tree a smaller size, keeps it a pretty good form and shape to hang the apple. Yeah, so apple and pear, peach and apricot, so stone fruit, and then this one's home fruit. This is usually how we're trying to prune them. There's different ways to prune them too if you're doing a dwarf tree, and if you have questions on that, you can meet with me afterwards and we can go over that. That's pruning in a nutshell. We'll go over a lot more this winter and have some examples. Depends which one. The pine trees obviously get huge and they're kind of in a different category. So fun fact, almonds and peaches are in the same family. They're stone fruit. Basically, you're eating the pit on an almond of what a peach would be. They're really closely related. So you can prune an almond the same way as you would a peach. Pistachios, I think you're pruning a little bit more like this guy. And pistachios are another one. If you do pistachios, you have to have actually a male tree and a female tree. Pecans are the same way. You have to have a male tree and a female tree to get nuts. Almonds are self-fruitful. That's most of the nuts. We have grown black walnuts and stuff around here, but they haven't done well as well. Okay. Oh, pests. Oh, avocados are kind of considered citrus. You can start them in your house, but they get huge when they produce. It takes about 6 years to produce an avocado. Well, that's another fact too. With most fruit trees, you're looking at 4 years before you really start getting some fruit production on them. The first year, you're going to want to pull all the fruit off. So you plant it, if there's any fruit on it, pull it off. Second year, same thing, try and pull the fruit off. What we're doing with that is we want the tree to grow vegetatively and not reproductively. So the reproduction is the fruit. It puts a lot of energy into that fruit. That energy should be going into the vegetative growth and the growth of the tree. The first 2 years, usually 3, unless it's grown a lot, you're trying to strip off all the fruit. You might lose 1 or 2 on the 3rd year, because we're all going to do that anyway. I do not. Just to see what the fruit's going to be like, because you're working years on it. And then the 4th year, you're going to start getting production, and by year 6, they should be in really heavy production. They're growing.
Is that true for pomegranates too?
Yes, Pomegranates should be producing after 4 to 5 years if they're, and pomegranates, you can tell they're really wispy, and if they get a fruit on, it's gonna be laying on the ground almost the first couple of years. So, yeah, you wanna pull the fruit off the pomegranate. Yeah, and it's a little hard when you buy a larger tree, because then you have to say, well, how many years is it? Or how old is it? You have to kind of gauge. Okay, so the next big thing I wanted to cover, and it's the largest one, so sorry I saved it for last, is pest management. So pests are by far the biggest problem, especially in our area. We live in a desert, we've made it green, and when you do that, every pest for 1,000 miles is gonna find the green spot. And that's the case here. We've been growing peaches here for a long time, and we can do it, they grow well, but the pest pressure is higher here than it would be somewhere else. Because we are in the desert, the pests have found a paradise, an oasis, and they're there. So, again, we're going to break them up into 2 categories. So going back to the apples and pears, palm fruits, they have a unique class, and then stone fruit also has. Watch pass this guy around. This flies off. So north flies. There's one on. There's these little black. It's amazing. Something so small can cause a lot of damage. Little tiny black cylinders are moths. This is the peach twig. If you've ever wondered what they look like, we usually see the larva in the peaches. This is the moth. This is the moth. There's just a couple on here. That's the moth that lays the egg that turns into the larva that digs into your peach that causes wormy peaches. So if you guys want to look at it and then pass it around. Unless you want to get stuck to it as well. So with stone fruit, the peach twig borer is the #1 pest, insect pest that we have. That's what creates the wormy fruit.
Oh. They're the ugliest, best tasting.
So the pest, though, this is the larva. This is right above it. That's what the larva looks like. The little worm that makes wormy peaches. So that's the #1 pest. What that does, one, you're going to have a worm in your fruit. You have more protein, I guess. This is good, but it will cause your fruit to drop prematurely. So they go in, they'll eat around the pit, and they usually cause that fruit to drop much prematurely, more than it would have. It won't ripen all the way. It does have the blemishes. I've seen people where they'll bottle them and they don't get it out, and then you'll find them at the bottom of the bottle. So there's some problems with it. You can work around it if you want to. But there are some sprays you can put on. Each twig. So there's peach twig borer is our #1 pest that we have with peaches. They also go for cherries. Just because it's peach twig borer doesn't mean it won't go for something else. Peaches, cherries, and apricots. They will go into plums as well, I believe, but those are the 3 main problems that we see. Cherries, it doesn't really bother cherries. We don't have many pests. Everyone get to see that guy? Problem in cherries, that is one of the main causes for cherry tree failure, is they will ruin the tree. So the peach twig borer will go into the fruit, it will go on the end of the twig. That's what they got their name for, on a peach tree or apricot, and they'll eat around the leaves. You'll see it die back, or you'll see some sap coming out of the end of the twig on your tree. And that's the sign that you have some twig borer in your trees. They can also go in at the trunk, though, and that's where the most damage will occur, is they will eat around the inside of the tree, and it will girdle the tree, basically, if they go the wrong way, I guess. So they can cause some damage. There's the lesser peach twig borer, which is what we typically have. There's one also called the greater peach twig borer, which the moth is much bigger. They go in right at the base of the tree and they will actually girdle the tree. We don't have that in southern Utah much. It's a northern Utah problem. So we'll put it up there hopefully. But we don't have it much down here. It can move down here. We can eventually get it, but we haven't gotten it yet. So we don't have to worry about that. So this is what people will spray trees for if they're trying to keep this guy out. Farmers, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people, farmers don't spray just to spray. They actually hate spraying because it takes so much time to spray a full tree, and if you have a lot of them, it just takes a long time. But we're trying to keep out the peach twig borer. That will cause wormy fruit, it'll cause it to drop early, it will cause damage to the tree. A peach tree will live about 30 years and be productive. After that, they start to really go downhill really fast. So we're trying to keep this guy out. That's the #1 insect pest. There are some organic options though that I was going to give you guys if you want to spray your trees, come out and do it organically. So there's 3 chemicals that you can use that are considered to be organic. That you can use on peach twig borer. You spray about once a month to keep them out. First one that I think works best. This is the chemical. It's melted. How you spell it? Next one is pyrethrin. And the last one is called BT. I can't. I got when to look at the label, but it's Bacillus thuringiensis. How you say that? That's why we call it BT. That's what BT stands for. These are some organic options that you can use. When you do spray fruit trees, try and use at least 2 of these and alternate. Try not to. Spinosad works great, but if you use it time after time after time, your bugs will build up a resistance to it to where it's not effective. If we use like pyrethrin or BT every other time, some might survive the spinosad, then we're going to kill it with BT. Try and keep that resistance from building up. So that's peach twig borer. That's what usually, if you spray a tree, that's what you're trying. The other one on our pome fruits, our apples, it's a similar bug, but it's different. So it's about the same size. It's a moth. It's the codling moth. I think they're a little bit more vicious than peach twig borer. But if you don't spray, you will get multiple. This is what the damage looks like in an apple. We'll pass it around, but they'll go in. You'll have these brown spots. You'll have it's frass. It's insect food. What's coming out. That brown powdery sawdust type stuff is frass that they're leaving behind them as they're drilling into your apple. They're going for the seeds. They really like them. Have an apple. Powdery moth. Is the #1 pest for as well. The same thing applies though. All of these kind of transfer over. You can use all of these on codling moth as well. There are some commercial or more industrial insecticides you can use. Some of the old ones that have been around for a long time, like malathion. There's permethrin, which is the synthetic version of pyrethrin. It's not organically made, but they've simulated it in the lab, so it's a very similar chemical. There's some different things that you can spray to keep them out. So for insect pests, those are the main ones that we're shooting for. There's some other ones that pop up. I'll pass this kind of stuff on one of my peach trees. These are spider mites. Has anyone ever dealt with spider mites before? They're pain in the rear end. This is what they look like. Mites are super small. You won't be able to see the mite, but they call them spider mites because of they create webbing in between the leaves. So if you want to look at that, you can see the webbing. You can see some little dirt particles that have been caught in the web. So that's what causes. Guys left when we were talking about dull leaves. This will make your leaves look dull. They'll make them shrivel and crinkle a little bit. They'll have little white spots on the actual leaves. Those are spider mites, and you have to use either a miticide or you can use a horticulture oil or soap, horticulture soap to spray them off. Also, if you get spider mites, and also this works on aphids too, if you get a really good stream of water coming out of your hose, you can reduce the population quite a bit by going off and spraying them off really heavy with your hose. So if you don't want to spray an insecticide, you can. Also, they like dirty leaves. Spider mites do.
Well, we've got one leak. Really good.
Yeah.
Yep. Will that kill the leaf, the moths?
Nope, they don't eat the.
mites?
I don't think. They might though. Worth a try. Soap. Horticulture soap. So it's kind of like soapy water. You spray it on, and it basically suffocates or smothers the insects.
You do that with Dawn dish soap? Is that what they're doing when they do that?
You can. It's not labeled for it, so I can't tell you to, but it does work. So yeah. Yep. I probably do too. So the last test is a fungus I want to go over. Sorry, we're over a little bit on time. If you need to leave, you definitely can. The last one is a fungus. So we're really fortunate living in a hot desert. It's not humid. Fungus loves a hot, humid climate, and it will just explode. We have the heat. We really don't have the humidity unless we create it. So there's really two funguses. One we don't see too much, but it can pop up, which is powdery mildew. If you've ever had roses, you probably had powdery mildew. They're little white powdery spots, and they're gray. That's what they look like. They can cover the fruit. They can, if it's really bad, it'll cover the whole fruit, and you can't eat it at that point, anyways. With powdery mildew, that loves.
It has the powdery mildew on it.
So it's hot. We hit them with sprinklers. Makes it really humid, and that powdery mildew just explodes all over the tree. And if you hit it, it'll actually go if it's really bad on your fruit. So powdery mildew is one that's easy to fix because we create the problem. We just have to adjust our sprinkler so it's not spraying into the tree. We can hit the bottom, we can hit the bark, that's fine, but we don't want to hit the whole leaf. The other one is not quite as easy. It's called Corinium blight or shot hole. So I have two pictures. It shows up differently in different parts of the tree. Apricots, if you ever had apricots look like this, they have little pimples on them basically. That's Corinium blight or shot hole. This is a peach leaf, and this is how it shows up in the leaves. It's kind of gnarly looking when it first comes on. It's purple. It's bright purple, like neon purple. And it comes on in spots. It eventually die and dry out, and it falls out and leaves these holes. So they call it shot hole. Looks like someone took a shotgun and shot your tree. So that's the nickname for it. So that's what it looks like in the leaves. This is what it looks like in the fruit. You have to use you can do two things. You can try and cut out the infected branches. If it's widespread enough, you spray a fungicide. So you find a fungicide that has it on the label. The best time to spray it is right when the blossoms are about to pop. To spray a fungicide, then you at the same time you're putting on dormant oil typically too. I didn't go over that. I'll have to backtrack, but put it on then, and then throughout the year, if it's a rainy year, like we wish it was this year, if it's rainy, fungus will spread when it rains. So if it's a problem you have, you know it's there. When it rains, right after go out or before even, you can go out and hit it with a fungicide to try and keep that fungus from spreading. But if you guys want to look at those, apricots is super common though around here. Really well. So one that you about have to spray for if you do get it. It's really common throughout all of Utah. We do have it here quite a bit. So it's if you get it, don't worry got too much. It's something you can control. That's the main fungus we get. Other than that, we don't have too many problems.
We have a 5-year-old pear tree in this year.
That's another one.
Is it?
Nope, it's not. What you have to do, so fire blight is another one that it's a fungus that goes in on apples and pears specifically. It's so specific. It will start on the tips of either the buds or the tips of the branches, and it will turn black. Yep, turns black and it curls and dies back. What you can do with that one is you can go in with your pruning shears and you take a Clorox bleach water solution. You cut out the infected area and you go about an inch past it, make sure you get it all, and then you dip your pruners, because you can spread it with your pruners. So you dip it into your Clorox bleach solution, your pruners, and then you make another cut. We need to you cut out all the infected area, and hope that will reduce it. Yep. And it's pears get it the worst. Apples get it, but they tolerate it better. But pears are really susceptible, especially barley. My favorite. Okay, anyways, I'm gonna let you guys go because I've kept you a little bit too long. If you have questions, I'll stay as long as you guys have questions. I have some cards too. I work for the extension office. That's my job. If you have problems, I'll help you figure out a solution for them with your fruit trees or any other agricultural. Yeah. Oh, if you want to look at some nectarines, this is really typical. One last thing. This is what they call cap facing. What happens when you talk about the biggest difference between a nectarine and a peach is the buzz. The buzz gives them a peach enough protection that nothing will bite on it when it's really young. This happened when it was blooming, and it's hard to control. And how nectarines look around here for the most part. So right when it's blooming, the blossom opens up, and the fruit is actually really, really small on the inside. And we have thrips. They're super small, and they will go and they'll just poke it, and they'll suck up the juice in it. And it causes these blemishes. But as that fruit grows and gets bigger, those blemishes are still there, and it causes the scarring and the weird tissue they taste off. But that it's hard to grow a nectarine because of the insect pressure. You can spray them as soon as the blossoms fall off. Hit them with a spray to reduce this quite a bit. Yeah, so you can use one of and not BT. Use either pyrethrin or spinosad. You can hit with one of those right when the blossoms fall off. But that is how nectarines often look, unless you can that reduces it. But there's nothing really wrong with them. They just look like.
The bugs know which ones to.
And there's something about damaged fruit that it changes the flavor, and sometimes the fruit or the sugars will accumulate differently. Yeah. So it's kind of like a watermelon. If you get a watermelon that has different scar tissue on it, it'll actually be a better tasting watermelon. But they're ugly, so no one buys them. So if you know what you're looking for, you can get a better tasting watermelon. But peaches are the same. We've had some that they get some cap facing where they're deformed a little bit. They're lopsided. They taste different, but it's almost a better taste. Yeah. People won't buy them, but you get to eat them. Okay. Anyways, I'll stick around. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Hope I didn't Oh, yeah, it's probably a slime. That's a terrible dog vomit. Yep, that's me. It's probably a dog vomit. I guess it's a slime mold, and it's harmless. It looks I would just, I would but what I would do too is spray it, get it, so that you're not gonna hit it. Yeah, it's a common one we see. Dog vomit fungus.
Thank you.
That's other. And if you get really bad wind, we haven't had some bad.
They said that the star.
Yeah, so the grass is on the,
They're just strong.
yeah, this is usually this one and it does work. The silver mite that causes the silver color to show. Looks like it may have some or it's a little bit yellow water, but if it's mites, it would cause it. But this is see, look, it's like
Because the thing with I kind of.
So I would, yeah, try and make sure it has that water it needs to see something like a silver mite, basically just sucking in the other leaves. Yeah. Sometimes the yellow leaves, it's basically a leaf that's either gotten overcrowded and it's just died and the drops fall out, or something silver mites, if it's bad enough, can cause the leaf to die. Usually they fall off.
Yeah, well, they on the back side, you said most of the time.
Yeah.
It's not the same on the front side.
They're on the back. Not like spider mites really have that. They're microscopic. It is. I actually don't forget it. Let's spray it off. Some water, just water to see if that helps. That'll kill the mice. Right into the, yeah, it's water to where it's soaking the leaves on the inside as much as you can. I'm gonna see if that will help. Mites out of that. Yep, yep.
Okay, we are doing that sort of. Okay, well, since we moved in, we moved in, the thing is, they have no cement. Once it's there, we have large yards, so we can put down the trees. That's what, and it's too late to plant tomatoes. I even have.
Well,
I can still plant something back there.
if you plant them, they might struggle a little bit at first. You can keep them shaded just to keep the sun off of them. They might produce it. So it takes about 90 days to get a tomato. Hope so. I hope it has something to grab it. If not, I got some more. I think it's the second week in